Hello, and welcome to Book Talks, a series of conversations with authors about their books, hosted by Barber Library. My name is Michelle Spomer, and I'm the director of Barber Library. Our author today is Dr. Donna Giver-Johnston. She will be having a conversation with Dr. Leanna Fuller about her book, Claiming the Call to Preach, 4 Female Pioneers of Preaching in 19th-Century America, published by Oxford University Press. The Reverend Dr. Donna Giver-Johnston is director of the Doctor of Ministry program at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary and joined the seminary this year. Mm-hmm. She is an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church USA with more than 20 years of experience in pastoral ministry. She is also an experienced theological educator and writer. Her areas of expertise include homiletics and liturgics, practical theology, feminist scholarship, and theological education. Dr. Giver-Johnston earned an MA and a PhD from Vanderbilt University. Both are in the field of religion and specifically in homiletics and liturgics. She also has a certificate of teaching from the Vanderbilt University Center for Teaching. She was awarded the John T. Galloway Preaching Award by Princeton Theological Seminary in 1996 and was named the Field Education Supervisor of the Year by Vanderbilt Divinity School in 2013. Dr. Giver-Johnston has authored many journal articles and book reviews, as well as 3 books, one of which will be the focus of this evening's book talk. Dr. Leanna Fuller, the Joan Marshall Associate Professor of Pastoral Care here at PTS, will be Dr. Giver-Johnston's conversation partner tonight. They will be exploring and discussing Dr. Giver-Johnston's book, Claiming the Call to Preach, 4 Female Pioneers of Preaching in 19th-Century America. Claiming the Call to Preach traces the history of call through the 19th century at a time when the question of women's call to preach, although seemingly fixed by ecclesial authority and cultural convention, was being raised by courageous women in different settings through different genres and to different effect. So before we start, I have just a few housekeeping matters. First, we will be, for those of you online, we will be posting bookshop.org and Amazon links in chat for those of you who wish to buy Dr. Giver-Johnston's book. Of course, those of you who are local can come to Barber Library and check out the book if you have a library account. Library accounts are available to anyone who is local for just a small annual fee. Also, we will be posting a link to an online subject guide developed for this book talk, which includes books, journal articles, and websites that will help you explore this and related topics. This excellent guide was created by our user services librarian, Tisha Wu. There is also a curated book display upstairs that you can, those of you who are here, can peruse after the book talk. And there's also a bibliography of these books that you can take home with you on that small table back there. For those of you online, the bibliography is available through the online subject guide. And for those of you interested in more information about our 2 conversation partners, links to their faculty pages will also be provided. That's a lot of links. Please be aware that this book talk will be recorded and then posted in a couple of places. We will provide links for these as well at the end of the book talk or beginning, whichever. You may want to view the live transcription for those of you online during the book talk, which you can see by clicking the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions that you would like to ask, we invite you to do this throughout the conversation by clicking on the Q&A button, also at the bottom of your screen, and entering your question. Lastly, I'd like to thank our communications staff, Melissa Logan and Robin Menard, who help us with advertising and registration. I'd also like to thank the fabulous Bobby Jarsulik, I always get that wrong, for being our Book Talk ever-present tech support person. And finally, thanks to Tisha Wu for creating wonderful educational resources as well as setting up this event. And now, finally, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Fuller and Dr. Giver-Johnston.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you. And those of you online, welcome. You heard in Michelle's introduction that Dr. Giver-Johnston studied at Vanderbilt and worked at the Vanderbilt Center for Teaching. That is actually where we met, lo these many years ago. So it's really fun and kind of an interesting way that life works out that we've ended up together on the same faculty here at Pittsburgh Seminary. So it's a joy for me to be here tonight and to talk with you about this book.
Thanks.
So I'm just going to jump right in because I know everybody is so interested to learn more about the book and your process of writing it. In the preface to your book, very first page, you begin with a little bit of your own story and how it led you to this particular topic in this research. Would you share a little of that story with us and kind of explain how it started your journey into learning about these pioneering women?
Yes, thanks. And thank you, Leanna. It is good to be here together on this faculty after all these years. And thank you so much, everybody, for being here and online. I know that there's people there. Thanks for joining. So this story started a long time ago. As I remember it, I was about 12 years old, and I grew up Roman Catholic, and so I had gone to confession and was kneeling in the pew saying my prayers of penance. And in that time, I thought I heard a voice from on high. I thought God was calling me to serve in the church. I was very confused by this, as you can imagine. So I went home and told my mom, and she marched me straight to the priest, Father Sengel, and said, "Tell your story." And so I shared the story, and as I remember it, his response was something like this: "Well, as a girl, you have two options. You can become a nun or sing in the choir." And I remember thinking, well, at 12 years old, I was just beginning to realize that not all boys had cooties, so I didn't want to become a nun. And I also thought to myself, obviously, Father has never heard me sing. So the way I interpreted that as a 12-year-old girl was that that call from God was probably meant for the little boy kneeling next to me, and I had just overheard it. And so I kind of tucked that away and went on with my life, went to college, got my first job in Washington, D.C., and I walked into a Presbyterian church on a Sunday morning, and I saw a woman in the pulpit. And it was one of these, what? That's possible? And I remember thinking at that time, right as I saw her, I said, oh, this is what you want me to do. And so that began my sense of hearing my call. It took me a long time to do it. That was a decade later after I'd heard my first call. But then as I went to Vanderbilt and had lots of students in preaching, I began to hear that they had similar stories. That whether it was their parents who didn't believe they should preach because the Bible said so, or whether they said, well, I've never heard God's voice, so how could you, a woman, hear that? Or, women are well suited for baking bread or teaching children or something like that, not so much to preach in the pulpit. And so once I heard other women's stories, I realized this was not just my story. And if we were ever going, and these were women today that were still struggling with trying to claim their call to preach. And so I began to think, how can this change? And actually, ironically, in thinking about making a change in the future, I decided what I needed to do was to do some research in the past. That there had to be other women in the history of the world, of our country, that struggled with this and found a way through. So that started my path for the research for the book.
Great, thank you. So going into that piece about researching the past and telling the stories of these women in this book, one of the key ideas in the book, it's introduced early on, but it appears a lot of different times throughout, is this idea of the narrative of neglect. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you would share with our audience here tonight what you mean by that phrase and how it shaped your research.
Yeah. So, when I learned that there was a woman that was ordained in 1853, Antoinette Brown Blackwell, the first woman ordained in the Protestant Church in America, and I was blown away. There were so many stories that I had never heard, never learned in any of my classes. And I began to research and found out that there was a lot of those similar stories, but that it was a narrative that was neglected to continue to be told, especially around the topic of women's call to preach. And what I realized is that call, as we think about what is the call to preach, well, it's a divine summons, right? It comes in lots of different ways. But there's a second part of the call to preach, and that is, it's not just between you and God, it's also between a congregation or a ordaining body, right? So what I discovered is that there's this gender gap between the inward inspired call and the outward institutional call. And so, in my research, when men would get a call, it would be like a celebration, because it was a kind of a foregone conclusion that they would be ordained. But when a woman was called, it began an arduous journey and lots of, obstacles and lots of reasons why she shouldn't be ordained. And so there was this big gap between an inward and an outward call. And that's where the narrative of neglect was that I wanted to really learn more about.
I imagine, and I think we know from the bibliography and even the books you cite in your own book, that a lot of people have written about women preaching, women's call to preach, things like that. How would you say that your book is different from those who have written about this subject before?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So there have been a lot of books written since about 1990, kind of leaning into that narrative of neglect and trying to give us. And so I've got some books with me that I'm happy to share later. One I read at Vanderbilt that kind of opened, it was an encyclopedic, volume, of all of these women who have been ordained or preaching in the 1700s, 1800s, and onward. And so that was really interesting to learn that women have preached, right? And actually, one of my chapters goes all the way through from the early church, the monastics, the Reformation, the revival time, to show that actually women preached in all these early centuries. And it wasn't until the 13th century that it was forbidden for women to preach. So that was something new that I learned as well. And so, but how my book is different, I realized, is that even today, women, they can read these books and say, oh, women have preached, but a precedent doesn't make a practice, right? So just because women have preached doesn't mean that that allows women to claim their call to preach. So I realized that what I needed to do was to do something different. It's not enough just for women to know that women preached, or even that they should, but how they claimed their call. And what I realized is that people have said, well, if women can articulate a call narrative, not just their story, but pay special attention to how that call is shaped, how that narrative is expressed, and then they can get a hearing. And so that's really what I explored in my book, is what is the rhetoric that each of these women used? And the 4 different kinds is what I explored, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But that's what makes my book different than others, is it's not just saying that women preached, but how did they? How did they use their rhetoric to actually claim a call and then preach?
So you're leading very well into my next question, which obviously from the subtitle of the book, we all know that this book centers on 4 different pioneering women from the 19th century. They are Jarena Lee, Frances Willard, Louisa Woosley, I keep getting that one wrong, and Florence Spearing Randolph. And I wonder if you would just tell us a little bit about each of them, maybe a little about their rhetoric that they use that you were just mentioning, and perhaps their legacies. And also why or how you chose these 4 women, because I imagine there were a lot more you could have chosen.
Yeah, thanks. So to answer that question, I want to start off by just reading a paragraph from the book, and then I'll talk about each of the women. So I begin by telling the stories of some pioneering American women who lived during the 19th century, a time when Victorian ideas about a woman's proper place were coupled with a reprioritized religious belief of decency and order to prohibit women from most public speaking, including preaching. The changing intellectual, economic, social, and religious realities of 19th century America created a space in which these women could rhetorically challenge the prevailing understandings of a woman's place. The question of a woman's role in religion was addressed in various contexts. Within itinerant preachers' exhortations and private prayer meetings, at revivals and women's rights conventions, in theological schools and churches. The question of women's call to preach was addressed by women of different racial and social backgrounds, denominations, and geographic locations in their written and spoken rhetoric. Within this volume, I introduce the reader to women who imagined their voices could speak a word of change, even a word from God. Through their rhetoric, they dream a different world of justice and argue their case in such a way as to gain a hearing. These women challenge the cultural conceptions limiting women's public voice, to make claim to sacred pulpits, places, to engage in sacred persuasive speech, and to preach as ordained ministers of the sacred office. Jarena Lee defended her personal experience of divine call as legitimate. From a public platform, Frances Willard argued that the divine call to preach is in a woman's nature and role in society. Louisa Woosley interpreted the Bible as endorsing women's call to preach. Florence Spearing Randolph preached an inclusive call wrapped in traditional theological language. Each of these four women represents a typical woman of the 19th century who occupied a specific cultural context. Together, they typify the cohorts of their generation. They are from the North and the South. They are black and white, rich and some poor. They are formally educated and not. They have access to different types and platforms of writing and speech and are constrained by different types of authority. The women chosen for this book are diverse in many ways, but they share the same commitment to their own call and to the church. So that's a little bit of how I chose these women. Is I really wanted to have some diversity, different religious denominations, different races, because that really plays into what kind of writing they had access to, basically. So let me talk about Jarena Lee. So she was born at a time right as the Declaration of Independence, had been issued, and so it was all about all men are created equal. And so for Jarena Lee, as a black woman, she realized that all did not mean all. And so it certainly didn't include women and certainly didn't include blacks. Jarena Lee, though, had a very powerful experience where she actually heard God's call and saw a vision of preaching in the pulpit. Well, as a young, uneducated black woman at the time, she was, very confused by this, and married someone who was a preacher, thinking, well, he could take care of, fulfilling this call. But he actually died early after they had two children, and it was kind of as others have described, a fire shut up in her bones. She tried so hard to not do this, but it kept coming back and back. And so one time when she was responding to a male pastor who had preached a sermon, and at that time the bishop was there, and she had gone to him before and asked for his permission and for his to get a license to preach, and he had said, no, our discipline does not allow it, in the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia is where she was. But when he saw her preach like this, he could not say no anymore. He realized she had the call and the gifts to preach. So he never did give her a license, but she was allowed to be an itinerant. And so she would travel all around the country preaching. And as she recorded the number of sermons she preached, the number of souls she saved, and she even went into the South to preach at this time, which was, around Civil War, even before the Civil War. So it was very dangerous, actually. She could have been sold into slavery. But she was so committed to preaching. So what she did was she used the rhetoric of personal experience. I had this personal experience of a divine call from God. And so then she wrote an autobiography, and she actually published it. It was in 1836. a long time ago at the time. And of course, nobody would publish it for her, so she published it herself and then distributed copies. But the fact that it survived today, that was the joy of doing this research, is that, that could have easily been kind of forgotten, right? But it was preserved. And so I was thrilled to be able to actually read her words of her autobiography. And so that's the rhetoric that she used, is to be able to claim, this is my story, and I'm going to stand by it, because when God calls, you have to answer. So let me just read, because I want to get the words of the women in the room. So one sentence, she said, "To my utter surprise, there seemed to sound a voice, which I thought I distinctly heard and most certainly understood, which said to me, 'Go preach the gospel.'" And then as far as her rhetoric goes, when she was making this case, she said this: "For as unseemly as it may appear nowadays for a woman to preach, it should be remembered that nothing is impossible with God." So for her, it was all about God and God's call. So that's Jarena Lee. The second woman is Frances Willard. And she was very different than Jarena Lee. A white woman, she was educated. She was a professor at Northwestern University in Chicago. She was the president and national spokesperson of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU. So she was somebody who was on the circuit. She was traveling all over. She was speaking against temperance, or for temperance, I should say. And she was somebody who, they called her a gospel talker, and she felt like she was called to preach, but she wasn't allowed. The church did not allow it at the time. And so she understood in her baptism that she was to do good in the world. And so that became her mission, is how can I do the most good in the world? So like I said, her funeral was like this, just thousands and thousands of people. She was very well known at the time. The way she used her voice was she wrote a book called Woman in the Pulpit, published in 1888. And what she did is she asked some men, she has a chapter on asking men, why do you think women are called to preach and why should they? And then she asked a lot of different women across many different denominations to basically share their call narrative, saying why they think that they are called to preach. And she was a little different because she was born at a time when it was the cult of domesticity. So industrialization was separating the spheres between men's work and women's work. And so what she did was she very strategically leaned into that cult of domesticity, where they said a woman's place is in the home. And so what Frances Willard did was she extended what home looks like into the world. So she said, of course, women have the right nature and disposition to care for people. And so they should do that more broadly than just their children. They should care for the whole world, care for the whole church. So what she did and the other women did is what I call re-inhabiting these authorities. So the cult of domesticity was could have been a real barrier, but she, what I call, re-inhabited that and used it for her own good to make her case. So Frances Willard, she says, the strongest argument in favor of a woman minister is found in woman herself, in her sympathetic and intuitional nature, in her high moral sense, in her deep and fervent religious spirit. And what she said too is the mission of the ideal woman is to make the whole world home-like. A true woman carries home with her everywhere. Its atmosphere surrounds her. Its mirror is her face. Its music attunes her gentle voice. But home's not merely four square walls. So that's Frances Willard. The third one is Louisa Woosley. And she was a Kentucky housewife that was fervent in her evangelical faith, and the Bible was most important in this context. This was during the Cane Ridge revivals, the Second Great Awakening, and so people were really caught up in the Spirit and also, preaching the Bible. And she was the first woman ordained in the Cumberland Presbyterian Church in 1891. So she was ordained, But she also tried to convince her husband to answer her call to be a preacher, but he was a farmer and had no interest in being a preacher. And so she didn't think, she got a sense of call, but she didn't believe that women should preach. But she believed in the Bible, and so she read the whole Bible from Genesis to Revelation. She wanted to convince herself that women should not preach. And after she read the whole Bible, she realized that women could preach and that they should, that they're called to do so. And so then for her, it was a matter of just living according to what the Bible says. So like I said, she became ordained, but then the controversy began. And so there were challenges to her ordination, there were fights back and forth, there were people writing papers for and against, and in the end, they basically said, you can't take away her ordination. She's ordained by the church, she was called by God, so be it. So she went on to preach a lot of sermons and have a really long, robust ministry as well. And what she wrote is this. She wrote, her book was called Shall Women Preach? Let's see, what is exactly, because it's clever how she titled it. Shall Women Preach? Or The Question Answered. So we already know what she's going to say. And she said this, it is an established fact that the women of the apostolic age did preach, and the scriptures sustain her as a preacher. No matter what women gaggers may say, to all who have studied the Bible and have no pet theory to support, this truth is as clear as a sunbeam. So that's Louisa Woosley. And finally, Florence Spearing Randolph. So she was born a little bit later, so she straddles and goes into the 20th century, actually. And so she was ordained and installed as the pastor of Wallace Chapel, African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Summit, New Jersey. She was educated, and she was born at a time, though, in South Carolina, right after the Civil War. So it was a time of Reconstruction. It was a time of the black codes still being enforced in South Carolina. Her mother died early, and so her father supported the 4 children. And at that time, she was given a choice of things she could study, and she chose to be a dressmaker. And so she started her own business as a dressmaker in South Carolina. And then she realized she could do a lot better going north for lots of reasons. And so she headed north and settled in New Jersey. And there she continued her dressmaking business. But she got this very powerful sense of call. She used to go with her grandmother to visit people and to minister to the sick. And she had this powerful sense of call to preach. But once again, didn't think that she was able to do that. So she prayed, and she prayed, well, God, I think I'm supposed to be a dressmaker, but if my business fails, then I'll go preach. And her business failed. So she went and began to preach, and she was ordained, and she served this church for 21 years. It was hard to get there because she was one that she would go in, she was called to these little churches that were problem churches. And she would get them to the point where they were doing well. And she didn't get paid, by the way. If anything, it was minimal. She would get them to the point where they were doing well and they could actually afford to pay a preacher. And then they would replace her with a man. So this went on and on several different times. And so finally, she was called to this church in Summit, New Jersey, where she lived out her ministry. And she wrote sermons. So I've highlighted different kind of genres: autobiography for Jarena Lee, speeches and writings by Frances Willard, and then Louisa Woosley wrote an interpretation of the Bible, biblical exegesis, and Florence Spearing Randolph's genre was sermons. That's what she did. She wrote sermons. And thankfully, they were found in the attic by one of her granddaughters, years ago. And so they were collected and put together. And, people, I'm looking at Tisha and Michelle, people that work in the library, it's like, how do these things get saved? And it was wonderful to find that somebody found them and put them in a book so I could use them for my book. So the sermon that I use in the book is called Antipathy to Women Preachers. She wrote this in 1930. And she preached this: "But God, with who there is neither Jew nor Greek, bond nor free, male nor female, in his wonderful plan of salvation, has called and chosen men and women according to his divine will, as laborers together with him for the salvation of the world." So that is Florence Spearing Randolph, and we have lots of her sermons, which were just a joy to read. So those are the four women. And like I said, very diverse, coming from lots of different places in the country and living at different times, constrained by different kinds of authority and obstacles. But they very cleverly, tactically re-inhabited those authorities so that they were able to use their rhetoric to claim their call to preach.
Thank you. So since we're talking about the rhetoric that each woman used, and you talked about the different forms and genres that each one used, one of the metaphors that you use throughout the book, in addition to narrative of neglect, is this idea of calling the question, and that each woman in her own way sort of called the question about women's preaching. And I'm wondering if you could explain for us, especially for those who might not have had a chance to read the book yet, what this metaphor means and why you chose it to explain what these different preachers were doing.
Right, so my argument in the book is that these four women did three things. First of all, they named the issue. And that's really important to try to disarm anything that has power, which I claim that this, the idea of call has taken on power, right, by institutions or by how it's understood, just by tradition and convention. So what these women did is they named the issue. They called it out. They said, there's a problem here, right? And the second thing they did is they engaged the issue tactically. They talked about, they interrogated it using their different rhetoric. And then the third thing they did was they called the question. So I'm a Presbyterian, and we do a lot with parliamentary procedure. And if you're at a meeting and someone's going on and on and on, and the point has already been made, somebody can say, I call the question, right? We're done with this debate. We don't need to go on and on. And so that's what these women did, is in effect, they called the question. They said, here's my argument. I've argued this well. We don't need to debate this anymore. Sadly, in the coda to the book, I say that here we are all these, years later, and we're still debating this issue. And that's in part why I wrote the book, is to not only help women and the others that are struggling with claiming their call to preach to find a way to do so, give them rhetorical strategies, give them scripts to use, but also to put the question out broader in our ecclesial bodies as to why are we still debating this topic. So.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask you a question a little bit that's less about the content of the book and more about the writing process. Mm-hmm. In terms of your actual process of writing the book, how did you go about doing this? I mean, one thing that struck me earlier when you were talking about the different women, I asked you sort of how you chose them, and you were saying that you were looking for a particular kind of thing, and that's part of the reason you chose these women. But I'm very curious about, how did you sift through all the different historical resources that there could have been about lots of different people in addition to these four. And then beyond that, how did you then go about sort of winnowing this down, figuring out what you wanted to emphasize, and writing it? And then I have a couple other questions about writing too, but we'll start there.
Okay. Well, my husband can attest that our dining room table at the time in Nashville, Tennessee was filled. We didn't do much eating at that table during the years that I was writing my dissertation. It was so fun. Once I realized that I wanted to do my project on the women's call to preach, then it was just so much fun. I remember I was down in the library looking at those old, microfiches and just all different ways of trying to access this information, right? And sometimes I would get to a place where I would, this woman has been preaching for years, but she didn't talk at all about her call. So then I couldn't use her, right? So it was really, there were so many women who have preached, but they never told their story or articulated their narrative about how they claimed their call, which is what this book is about, right? And as I said earlier, I really tried to find diversity, around race and economics and geographical locations and denominations, because I wanted to show that this isn't just isolated in one particular area, but it was really, widespread throughout the 19th century. So that was really fun as well. And I think my greatest joy, like I mentioned earlier, was to find Betty Collier Thomas, I think is her name, I have her book here, that she was able to find these sermons from Florence Spearing Randolph left in an attic that a granddaughter found. So there were some of those joys as well, being able to realize that and just give thanks that these things were found. One of the joys too is we went on a trip to Seneca Falls that I talk about in my introduction, and our kids were young at the time, but they were along for the road, for the fun. And that we went to see where Antoinette Brown Blackwell preached. She was the first ordained woman in the United States, as I said. And it was very disappointing to see this dilapidated house, that was not preserved at all. It was a church, then it was a house, then it was a barn, then it was a garage, and then it was fallen down. But the local guide said, but wait, we have this new historical marker. And so down the street, there's a historical marker that says that on this street, Antoinette Brown preached her first sermon. So that was really great too, just to be able to go to I went to Oberlin, went to the archives there and did some research. And so it was just really fun, to track down these stories and then to put them all in one place.
So you've said a little bit about this already, but I'm curious as to if there's anything else you want to add about what was most joyful or exciting about writing the book, but also what was the most difficult or challenging part of writing it?
Yeah, it's a work of history and rhetoric and theology and homiletics. So there's a lot of different, things that I was trying to weave together. To try to have enough of a grasp. I didn't want to, as we all know, we're all contextual, right? And it's really important to locate people. And so I did the best I could, in the pages I had, to describe what was going on historically at the time so that it would make sense, what the women were kind of responding to at the time. On my, I had people I was talking to, rhetoricians and, homileticians and historians, and trying to bring all of those pieces together. So it made a compelling and true story. Yeah.
So I have a question now that I didn't tell you in advance I was going to ask, but it has kind of bubbled up from our conversation. And you did allude to it a little bit earlier when you were talking about the coda to the book, because you go through this whole wonderful history and exploration of these 4 women preachers and how they defended their call to preach and called the question and said this basically should be settled. Mm-hmm. And then at the end of the book, you say, but it is not settled. Mm-hmm. Like, we're still arguing about it. And in the coda, you make a statement that's, I don't remember the exact language, but it's about, sometimes tactics aren't enough, and you have to turn to revolution. Mm-hmm. And you ask a question about how do you know when that tipping point is.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if you would share with us a little bit about what you meant by that and what's in your mind, and also how you're thinking about what's the future of this conversation going forward, being that for many of us the question has been called and we feel the debate should be over, and yet it isn't. Mm-hmm. And so then what do we do?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I don't have the answer. That's why I wrote the book, trying to, Yeah, I think, I'll tell a little bit of a personal account. So I was ordained and installed at a church in New Jersey and served there for a couple years. And then I was called to a small church, and I got there in about maybe a month or so after I had been serving there as their pastor. The clerk of session pulled me aside and said, just so you know, there were some people in session that were not too excited about you coming. You're the first woman that we've had as a pastor. However, she said, now that they've gotten to know you, they like you. They accept you as their pastor. And, for me, that was just a reminder that, for some, you have to have a face to the concept, right? So a woman preacher seems, so crazy for some people. But then when you get to know them as, they preach the Bible, they do funerals, and they preach the promise of the resurrection to eternal life. And, so I think for some people, they just need to have an experience of it. So it kind of takes away the scariness of it, maybe. I don't know. And I think, again, for me to learn that when people fall on saying it's tradition, to realize that for the first 12 centuries, women were preaching. So it's really not that, I think it was Pope Gregory IX who finally declared, he had to be ordained and women could not be ordained. And that changed the trajectory. But up until then, Jesus was interacting with women and the early church, all of that. So I think it's a matter of people being able to tell the story maybe in a different way. Also, to be able to challenge, to speak truth to power, to be able to say that this is not how I understand the Bible, this is not how I interpret the Bible. So, I think and then for me, I wrote this book hoping that it would, even if one person would be able to claim their call and be ordained, it would be worth writing the book. Even just for one person. And so when Oxford agreed to publish it, I was like, wow, it's going to be more than one, I hope.
Thank you. Well, that's all the questions I have. I wonder if we want to go ahead and open it up to the floor for questions for folks here in the room or online.
Can I share one more thing?
Please go ahead.
So to that end, I wanted to share the last chapter was really about trying to bridge. And I think your question about what do we do today, right, is trying to bridge. And I wanted to put these historical women in conversation with women today or others that are struggling with their call. So I actually kind of wrote scripts. And literally, I think that people that are struggling today can actually borrow these scripts. They don't have to reinvent the wheel. This has already been done for them, right? And so I'll just read one of them. This is from Frances Willard. So to the question, shall women preach? I say that this is how that they can answer them. And so Frances Willard's answer can be captured well in these three words: well, and in parentheses, hell yes. Amen. The word well reflects not only her desire to speak well and have patience until she thinks of the right words to say, but also her desire to always speak for women's rights with a womanly voice. The hell reveals the passion of the suffragist that she felt deep in her soul. She would never speak such a word, but thinking of it as a parenthetical would nevertheless give her the courage to stand up in front of a crowd or pick up her pen and speak a word of justice for equal opportunities for women who were naturally suited and equally called to public works, including preaching. If confronted with the question today, Willard would say, well, then pause, smile to herself as she considered her next words. Both fueled by passion, hell, and controlled by her well-measured character, she would remember her motto, let something good be said, and then she would simply but strongly say, yes. And so what I say is the last thing I want to share is the connection to today. So nearly 2 centuries after Frances Willard spoke her powerful rhetoric and claimed her call to preach, women still struggle with claiming their call. A seminary student related to me that when she shared her call to preach with a longtime member of the Women's Guild of the church, she faced polite but strong resistance. Don't worry, dear. Women in the church have an important place. They bake bread for communion or teach the children in Sunday school. It's tradition. We've always done it like that. That's what women are best suited for. The female student admitted to feeling excluded and frustrated, but she was not sure how to engage her challenger in discussing a different view of women's nature and role. I wonder, if this student had read about Frances Willard and knew her rhetorical defense, might she have had an effective strategy for engaging the dissenting opinion and a persuasive script for claiming her call to preach? So then I say, it is my hope that the woman challenged by a female church member about the restricted role of women in the church, and all those women similarly challenged, would be able to stand strong on Willard's shoulders and respond to the challenge with these words. Well, I can appreciate the value of tradition in the church, and tradition teaches us that God has given us each a call to some peculiar work, men and women alike. Some are called to bake the bread, others to teach the children, and others to preach the gospel. I am called by God to preach without question. I hope that you and the church will endorse my call because, well, hell, I think there's a room for reform. But if not, then I will find other ways to make my case, even if it means I have to do so from a public platform outside the walls of the church. Yes, I will join with other women who are seeking to honor both their call from God and their commitment to the church. I will exercise my agency and use my voice for those who are powerless to do so. So I did that for each of the women, kind of used one of their scripts and then rewrote it as how women could use it today.
Questions?
We have a lot of questions online. But I'd actually like to open, the first one is not a question, but a comment. We have a former president of PTS tuning in online. Dr. Giver-Johnston, Bill Carl here, former president at PTS. Thanks for writing your important book. I taught homiletics at PTS in the 1975 to 76 school year before going to Union in Virginia while finishing my PhD in rhetoric at Pitt. In my first class at PTS, one of the women told me she didn't think she could write her first outline. When I asked her why, she said, "I've never seen a woman preach." Mm-hmm. From that moment on, I made it my goal to give women permission to preach. Thankfully, things have changed, but we still have a ways to go, especially for women being called to more head of staff positions in large churches. So I wanted to open with that comment.
Thank you.
But some other questions we have one from Scott. Dr. Giver-Johnston, did the women preachers you highlight have a distinctive voice or style that the male preachers of the time did not? If so, how were their voices different? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. And that's what some people have written about. There's been books even in this century written about how women have a different way of preaching. So, they tend to use more examples, more personal stories, that kind of thing. I'm not sure. Sometimes I think what happens when we do that is we overgeneralize or, make something a little more simplistic than others. So I think rightly that's been challenged with more attention to specific examples. But to go to my book with that question is highlighting Frances Willard. So again, she was very much understanding about how women were received at the time, and so she dressed a certain way, she spoke a certain way. But once she was invited into those meetings, she was one of the only ones that was ever invited to Chautauqua Institute. That was a mixed audience of men and women. So she was invited into these places that women wouldn't have access to. And once she had their attention, then she could push her agenda. So very tactical, but very much understanding, how she could get access to those places.
Anyone have a question here in the room?
I'm curious what surprised you the most in your research.
Emily, I think one of the most surprises for me is that, wow, they made such convincing arguments in the, in the 1800s, and we're still having. Why are we still having this question, this debate? I think that was is that wow, they really did it so well, but surprised that maybe it wasn't. it was lost, that the narrative of neglect, right? It was somehow lost. And so I think part of this project is just to recover this historical narrative, so we can know more about them. So I think that was one of my biggest surprises. Yeah. Lisa?
I'm curious as to how your own call was either reaffirmed or challenged in some way. Or I can imagine you hearing in that very vein, wow, I could never do that. What ways were you affirmed or buttressed in your own call?
Yeah, no, good question. Yeah, first of all, it was just gratitude, right, for these women who've gone before and have made this case for us to allow me to be ordained without having to do all that, right? So there was a lot of that. But also realizing that that's not exactly true, because almost every day of my ministry, I had to do the same. So this is what I teach my female students especially, that you always have to be ready to make the case. So for some people, you go to the Bible. They challenge you in the Bible, so you better know your Bible and show where the Bible says you can preach. Some people will challenge you about, well, you've never heard God's call, so then you got to be ready to say, well, actually, when I was 12 years old, I did hear God's voice. And so really being aware of that every day you have to, and think about how to do it. For sometimes I would be really, matter of fact. Other times I'd make a joke. Other times I'd just ignore them. So you have to kind of decide, how am I what's my strategy for today? Doing funerals always, because people that weren't members of my church would say, I've never seen a female preacher. And I'd say, well, today's your lucky day, you have to kind of be ready to deal with whatever comes. But yeah, certainly lots of gratitude that I didn't have to do the hard work they did, but also realizing that actually we still have to continue to do that work every day. Yeah. Yeah.
How would you advise people, specifically male aspiring theologians like myself, how would you advise us on having conversations with people when they challenge your view as a male figure defending the right of women to serve in ordained offices of the church, specifically in the case of in priests, ministers of the word and sacrament of various denominations? How would you advise the men of the room to hold conversations about this?
Good question. Yeah. One of the books that I note, Frances Willard, she actually has a chapter in her book, Woman in the Pulpit, where she actually asks men to talk about, why they think women should be preachers, right? And some of the other women also had allies that were really important. Jarena Lee had Bishop Lee, who was really important, or Richard Allen. And then Florence Spearing Randolph had a bishop that was really important. So that's really key as well, is to have allies. So as far as how to do it, I think I would also be aware of the context. Are you talking to somebody for whom the Bible is like the ultimate authority? And then, so know your Bible, and be able to talk about the different scriptures that are there. If it's a situation where it's really about, the sermon and knowing about the pulpit as sacred space, and what that represents as well. So I think, just being willing to have the conversation in spaces that maybe women don't have access to is really important. So thank you for your willingness to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This just came up in the previous question a little bit. I was interested in the survey that you mentioned, where a group of women was asked why should women be allowed to preach. A group of men, why should women be affirmed in their call. I
just that they were tenacious, resourceful, tactical, and I think, you have to be tactical. Florence Spearing Randolph, to find the treasure of her sermons. She had one that she preached on race relations Sunday that was called "If I Were White." It's a powerful one. Yeah, and so being willing to take on, for her especially, not just what was going on in the church, but also she knew that she had the power of the pulpit, right? So she could begin to shape perceptions and shape attitudes for what was going out in the world. So to work for social justice, so she didn't take for granted her pulpit and her power. And I think that's what I really appreciated learning. And I tried to be mindful as I stand up on the pulpit as well, is that this is a privilege. And to use my words well, because you have people that are listening and you're shaping theology. And that's what she did so well. Yeah. Thank you.
We have some more online questions. One from John. Rhetorical spaces have been changing. From embodied personal testimony spaces, speeches, exegetical books, and church-based sermons to online social media, blogs, podcasts, TED Talks, YouTubes, full-length and shorts, and so on. Do you have any thoughts about how calling the question might occur in these new spaces, and how the resources you've identified might help?
Wow, great question. Right. I mean, we've got access to so many different platforms now and so many more people listening. And so, yeah, I think to think about the different strategies that were used in this book and the different kinds of a genre that can be used. I just gave four different ones that could be used at the time, but now it's so much bigger and broader. So I think it's, making sure you have diversity in those conversations, right? I really appreciate podcasts that are willing to take on hard questions, right? And to also explore what we have in common as a church. And in my coda, as you pointed out, the church really is sadly in decline now, and part of it is not realizing that we've got a lot of resources that we could be using kind of beyond the church walls, right? So I think that kind of technology is really, it's really an invitation. It's helping us. How can we get the message of the Christian gospel out into the world a little broader? And I think that could certainly be a part of it. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. You just mentioned church decline because we can't have a conversation without talking about that.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering, what wisdom do you imagine that these women about whom you've written might have for those of us who find ourselves in this situation, where doors are suddenly opening, but maybe they open onto stained glass cliffs, right? Churches are declining. Hey, let's try something different. We'll call our first woman, or we'll call our first president of color, right? I mean, come on, and then we sort of see, then the blame gets shifted to, right?
Yeah.
Here things are declining, and you know what I mean? And then there's this sense of correlation or even causation where it doesn't belong.
Mm-hmm.
What would these women have that's hopeful for us when we find that situation kind of repeating itself?
Yeah, good question. From someone who is the head of staff for an all-women staff church. So just wanted to call that out. Times are changing. So as far as I think about going back to what the women, certainly they claim they're called to preach, but looking at what the heart of how each of them were different. So Jarena Lee, it was all about listening to God. Really having people attune their ears and their hearts to how's God at work, right, in the situation in the world, and how can we be a part of that? Whether it's to have a women claim or call to preach, or to change the world in some other way for good, right? Frances Willard was all about listening to the culture, going outside the church and saying, what's going on here and how can we be a part of these changing the world for good is what her motto was. And Louisa Woosley, she was about reading the Bible, reading the Bible and really dwelling in the Word and hearing what that says to us today. And then for Florence Spearing Randolph, it was really about, seeing how can the church be a place that is inspired to go out and do good. So I think, while their message was, in some ways, I looked at them as how do you claim the call to preach, each of them had something very essential that I think we can use today, their wisdom, is really going deep into where they find God and their sense of call, and then how they can use that to inspire others to do good, even as the church is declining. Yeah. Thanks, Austin.
Thank you for such a rich conversation. I don't know where to stand. I feel like I want to stand here instead. So many more questions. I had a question, but we need to wrap things up. So thank you. Can we thank these two fabulous conversation partners? It was wonderful. I invite those of you who are here in person to look at the book display upstairs. There's also the bibliography for that display right here that you can take home with you. Those of you online, thank you so much for joining us. There are plenty of links that I told you about and that have been included in chat, so invite you to take a look at those and then come back to the PTS website for the recording if you're interested in that. Thank you very much. See you later. Have a good evening.